Welcome to Close the Gap, where we thoughtfully engage with CEOs and top industry leaders all working to close the female equity gap in the C-suite and boardroom. Christine Gannon, the CEO of Brightworks Consulting, and Dr. Antoinette Farmer-Thompson, a senior leader with Arizona State University, host insightful conversations responsible for moving the needle for female participation in the C-suite.
Welcome to Close the Gap. We are thrilled to have Dr. Joanna Massey, who is an experienced C-level communication expert and board director. She has more than 25 years of experience in media industry companies such as Condé Nast, Lionsgate, CBS, Viacom, Discovery, and Hasbro. Wow. She has managed brand reputation, corporate turnaround, crisis communication, culture transformation, and multi-million-dollar P&Ls. She's also a doctor of psychology, which she uses to advise companies and executive teams on all matters related to change management, especially when it comes to communicating with millennial and Gen Z employees, consumers, and investors. She currently serves as president and CEO of a consulting firm, J.D. Massey Associates, Inc., also known as JDMA. And Dr. Massey is also a corporate speaker and a trainer, as well as the author of books, Communicating During a Crisis, Influencing Others When the Stakes Are High, and Culture Shock, Surviving 5 Generations in One Workplace. In addition, Dr. Massey is an adjunct professor at Columbia University, where she teaches a master's level course in corporate communications. As a board director, Dr. Massey is a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors, and she currently serves on the board of 8B Education Investments, a financial startup. She also serves on the Resolution Project, a nonprofit that funds and mentors undergraduate entrepreneurs with businesses that do social good. Formerly, she served on the board of directors of the Resolution Project as a member of the audit committee. The University of Southern California, New York Alumni Club, she serves on that as a member of the executive board, and Colors, the LGBTQ youth consulting services. Dr. Massey is also an angel investor who advises female entrepreneurs on all aspects of seed funding. She previously served as managing director at Golden Seeds, which is an early-stage female-led investment firm with more than $125 million in total investments in over 170 female-run businesses. She's also a member of the Angel Capital Association. Dr. Massey holds 4 graduate degrees in both business and psychology, and she's a member of the American Psychological Association. And ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to have Joanna with us today, and it felt really important to share that information. Oftentimes we provide a high-level 50-word bio, but it's so important for people to know what you're bringing to the table. So thank you for indulging us and sharing that with us, and we're excited to have you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Christine, I think it's so important that you share her background, because to me, I've heard behavioral change. If we are really going to make progress in this area, it has to be about changing the workplace and the mindset. So my first question, Dr. Massey, fantastic to meet you. You've done significant research and reporting about multi-generational workplaces. How are you witnessing women of all generations stand up with resilience right now in the workplace? And our book is called Constitutional Grit, and we see grit very much equal to or being similar to resilience.
Well, first of all, I cannot wait to read your book. I was fortunate enough to be one of the people that asked to share some stories for it, and absolutely love the questions that you all asked. They were very thought-provoking, and they brought out things that I haven't talked about in years. So I think it's going to be a phenomenal book. In terms of resilience and grit, I love that term grit. It has a special meaning to me that was very recent, I must say. I went back to get an executive MBA I graduated from USC in 2016 with that EMBA. On the last weekend of the course, they had us go around and identify words that were important to us. And one of my classmates chose grit. And then they paired us up and they said, okay, moving forward, these two people, and they paired up all of us, there were about 72 of us, you're always going to stick together. You're going to check in with each other every couple of months. And I happened to get paired up with the woman who chose grit. And so for, several years now, every couple of months we check in and I text her and like, how's grit going? Right? So it's been a key word for me. And interestingly enough, at our graduation ceremony, the speaker had this huge slide behind him that said grit. And I was like, this word is everywhere. So anyway, I think that grit is very important and it is a newfound love for me. But to transition this to the 5 generations in the workplace, one of the things I think that we found in older generations, the silent generation who were born between 1928 and 1945, the boomers who are mostly identified as 1946 to 1964, and then Gen Xers who are 1965 to 1980. Grit really meant, stick-to-itiveness, getting along, doing what you had to do to get the job done. A lot of times it meant being a workaholic. It meant working above and beyond. It meant working more than our male counterparts to prove ourselves. I think it's important to remember that, and I talk about this a lot. I go into corporations and I do corporate speaking because I like to educate people about the backgrounds of all these generations to help us understand where we're each coming from. When the silent generation, who are now in their 70s, and by the way, some of them and 80s, and some of them are still in the workplace, when those women came to work, there were only 40% of the women back then were in the workplace. The rest of them were at home, 40%. The boomers, that shifted significantly. It went up to 66%, right? But if you think about it, the boomers are the hippie generation, right? Mm-hmm. It was all about, we want to change the world, women's rights, equal rights amendment, women can work, the birth control pill, all kinds of things that got introduced with that generation. So 66% of boomer women worked. And then 71% of Gen X women worked. So we saw a trend moving upward. But for us, it was about coming into the workplace, doing like the men did, being like the men were, and working harder, and in order to do it. These other generations, Millennial and Gen Z, they don't see it that way at all, right? They have been trained differently because they were raised by the women who are now seeing some level of power. Not a ton. We all have heard the stats about how many Fortune 500 CEOs are women. It's pathetically low. How many women corporate directors do we have? Very low. But we're making it in there, right? So we have turned around and trained our children and taught our children, that like you're equal. You can do anything, right? We told them that and they believe that. And so we're seeing a very different mindset from the younger generations, which I think is really refreshing. And I do think it's going to change it dramatically. Because the one thing I'll end with that part of the comment is by saying that women now understand that our superpower is not acting like the men. Our superpower is our difference as women and what we bring to the table as women.
I think what you said is really important in terms of how things are shifting and how all these different generations are viewed in the workplace. And given that, talk a little bit about your thoughts around how can we help men and women, other women that are in executive roles, as well as men, identify this talent? How do we identify female talent better so that more can come through the ranks?
When I talk to companies and when I do interviews, I like to talk about understanding. I really think that it's important for us to understand. And in my book, Communicating During a Crisis, I talk a lot about the difference between communicating effectively and influencing. They're different. You can be a very good communicator, but not influence people. And I've read a lot of books on influencing, and there's Actually a really famous one that I like a lot. It's by a gentleman named Dale Carnegie. It was written in the early 1900s, called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And the reason why that book is still relevant today, I mean, we're talking 100 years ago, still relevant today, is because he was talking about, when he was talking about influencing, he's talking about human nature. And that hasn't changed. So, but Mr. Carnegie gave like a list of 38 different things you can do, which feels very overwhelming. And so I like to make it simple. As a head of communications, I'm all about simplicity and clarity. So for me, it's 3 steps in influencing, right? The first step is you need to understand somebody, understand where they're coming from. Don't assume the worst. Don't assume that you know. Ask them and be genuinely interested in who they are, what makes them tick. Once we understand people, we can actually relate to them. Even people who seem extremely different from us, we can relate to. And I use an example. I love to use an example of if somebody's late on a project, for example, and you're instantly, as a boss, you might think, God, that worker is always late. Like they cannot get their act together. They're so disorganized. You know, instead of saying to the worker, you were late again, why? Which is puts the person in a very defensive place. Mm-hmm. You know, if the conversation comes from, hey, I noticed you missed the deadline. Can you tell me what happened? Or is everything okay? It's a very different conversation. And if that worker then says to you, yeah, I'm really sorry, my sister's sick, and I was fielding all these phone calls from family, and I'm dealing with her healthcare stuff, and I just really it was really hard to get it in on time. Then as a boss, you can say something like, I can relate. My mom was sick like a couple of months ago, and it's really challenging. Like I understand what you're saying. And if you can throw in a compliment, it helps to, it's unfortunate that you were late with it, but honestly, I really like the strategy in the document. I thought you did a good job. You have now set that person up to be influenced. And you can then provide them with facts and help them make a decision from a very calm and rational place. And I don't have to get into it right now, or we can get into it. I love talking about the brain and what happens when we're stressed, because it's important to understand. But if people are given facts and they can do it at a calm place, you can say to them something like, I really get where you're coming from. Next time, share that with me. Like, let's work on that together, because the thing is, if you're consistently late, then that's a performance issue. And I really want to be able to help you do your job better, because if it's a performance issue, then, there's a bigger problem. And that person, so you have a choice, like, next time, please come to me. Or if you're late again, then I have to write it up, and I don't want to do that. Right? You've then given that person a choice, and they can, from a place of calm, make a decision for themselves. Am I just going to constantly be late, or am I actually going to confide in my boss what's going on for me?
Very good. I want to go back to something you mentioned about stress. 2 things. It was very interesting. We interviewed a college student, an incredible young lady who was moving into her junior year. So it was the summer after her sophomore year. And her name is Shayla, and Shayla was able to obtain an incredible assignment at Point B Consulting, and did a phenomenal job. Normally, master's level students would get this internship. Wow. So I thought about what happens to the Shaylas of the world. And then we read part of our research, we discovered that the American Psychological Association said that when women know that there is unequal pay or discriminatory practices, they're more likely to be 2 times more depressed. And so my question is, how do you think, to your point, how can other women help other women multi-generationally achieve goals, starting with those entering the workplace vis-a-vis their executive plan, someone like a Shayla?
That's a really insightful question. I haven't seen that APA research, but it doesn't surprise me at all. And I don't think it only applies to women. I think you could take that and extrapolate it out to anyone who feels discriminated against, because that's basically what you're talking about, is discrimination against women in terms of pay equity and opportunity. And I think that some women are really good at this, about what I'm about to say, and some aren't. It's really about mentoring and helping. And the reality of it is, with the older generations, and this is not across the board, I'm going to make a very broad statement, but I want to make it clear this is not everybody. But with the older generations, they had to fight tooth and nail to get to the C-suite. Mm-hmm. And they had to, and there was only, if there was a position in the C-suite for a woman, there was only one position, and you had to elbow everybody out of the way, and the other women were your competition. And what we saw earlier in our history was women not helping women because of the need to fill that one spot. But what I love to say and remind people of is that equity is not a zero-sum game. Diversity is not a zero-sum game. We've been looking at it like it's a pie, and if you remove this piece of pie, there's less pie for everybody. And that can make it very threatening. It makes it threatening to the men who are in those positions of power, and it makes it threatening to the women who get into those positions of power and think there's not enough room for them. And what I like to point out, and we have enough research to back this up now, is that companies run by women, companies with female corporate directors perform better than the S&P 500 average. That they bring in more revenue, that they have that they perform better for shareholders. And ultimately, when you're talking about a publicly held company, the primary purpose of a publicly held company is to provide value to the shareholders. That is its mandate. So when you bring diversity to the table, whether it is diversity in race and ethnicity, diversity in gender, diversity in ability or disabilities, or in LGBTQ status, you are expanding the revenue and expanding the company, right? It's growing, not shrinking. And that provides more opportunity and more positions for everybody. And I think that what we see as a result, personally, I'm a Gen Xer, and as a Gen Xer, I have always, part of it is just my thing. I love mentoring people. I mentor a lot of women, and I give them a lot of time. And I have one woman who happens to work in PR. They don't all work in PR, by the way. It's more about mentoring them as leaders and managers and things like that. But one of them works in PR, and she is frequently texting me like, "What do you think of this pitch? What do you think of this?" And and she always feels bad when she asks me, and I'm like, "Don't feel bad. I love answering you. Like, I like giving my opinion. I think a lot of people do. I'm happy to share my experience. I hope it's helpful, but so I think we're a little shy to ask people for help. And my experience is I love helping. Now, not everybody does, but if you can find somebody who wants to share their experience and pass it on, that's gold for women to help move us up and through the ranks.
We had Betsy Berkhamer-Creder last week on our podcast, and she talked a lot about that and said, the old way of working where women really didn't help other women is gone. And those women are gone, or they're on their way out. And, our workplace really is representative of women who want to help other women, just like you're doing, in terms of reaching back, reaching across to provide that mentorship. So important.
I love Betsy, by the way, a little story. I as a freshman in college, I did my first internship at, Betsy had a PR firm in Los Angeles called Berkhamer Klein, and I was an intern at Berkhamer Klein.
That's fantastic. So I want to talk a little bit about your research related to crisis communication. You've written a book about it, and as an adjunct professor, you're teaching it, you are in this space. So can you talk a little bit about potentially how men and women handle this differently, and what are women bringing right now in this crisis mode we find ourselves in globally, right? How do you see that playing out for women, and what do you see their strengths are that they're bringing to the table?
And I love the influence piece you said. So if you can weave that in as well, because I think there's no way we get to where we need to go without the influence.
I think it's a vital question, and we are seeing a lot of it in the United States right now as we struggle with COVID-19, and we're seeing a lot of different communication styles. And like I said earlier, there's a big difference between being a good communicator, right? You can be a good communicator. You can have catchy slogans. People can remember what you say, but not influence them. You need a couple of things to be influential. And let me talk first about communicating. I think it's really important that the message be, I talk about this in my book, Communicating During a Crisis. The message needs to be timely, transparent, and truthful. I really like making things, try to make them easy. So I love that there's 3 T's there. And then the tone, it's really helpful when the tone is compassionate, confident, and calm. Okay, those are very vital ways that as a crisis communications person, I always need to make sure that as any executive, male or female, frankly, is conveying that during a crisis, during a corporate crisis. But in order to influence, interestingly enough, you need to speak with authority, right? You need to speak in that confident way, but you cannot speak in an authoritarian way. As people in the Western, this is a Western culture thing. It has to do with the United States, Europe, Western cultures, but we are indoctrinated to believe culturally that we are independent, that we are free, that we can make our own decisions. When you act when you're authoritarian, you're going to get pushback. That is not going to be influential with the majority of people. It works well with a certain set, but not a lot. So basically what's important in communicating is that people respect you. And by respect, I don't mean like, right? They need to respect you, which means they need to trust you. They need to believe you. And they need to feel, and this is part of the trust aspect, that you're leading them to safety. And when I use the word safe, I use it very broadly. Our brain all day long makes decisions that to keep us safe. That is its job. Its job is to protect the organism, meaning the body. So all day long, I'm making an assessment. Is this person safe? Is this conversation safe? Is this train ride safe? Is this job safe? Like all day long, my brain is making these assessments. If the brain deems it to be safe, I don't even know I've made that decision. It's completely automatic. If it deems the situation to be unsafe, then that's when stress kicks in and fear, and there's a reaction, there's an automatic reaction happens that in Western cultures is to become very defensive and to dig in to old beliefs and old behaviors. And by old, I mean young, from younger ages. And it's something that happens in the brain where the part of the brain that controls rational decision-making and, self-control and rational decision-making, that part of the brain goes offline because there's another part of the brain called the amygdala, and its job is to calm down the system and to keep it safe. So it's really important during a crisis that you come at it from a calm, confident, and compassionate way so that you can keep everybody else calm so that they can make decisions from a place of they can have rational decision-making, and self-control is fully present. That doesn't happen always in a crisis. So anyway, there's all these factors that go into it, but there are certain people who are really good at understanding that, and then there are other people who aren't. And I think we see examples of that a lot in politics, quite frankly. And we see that a lot from male politicians. And really what females bring to it is that level of compassion, that level of nurturing that's natural to us, that is not as natural to a male. And so you can sometimes, Twitter is literally it's like a snake pit of this like blaming, shaming, jumping on. And by the way, that is men and women. That is fully,
right.
that is both
right.
genders.
That's right.
But we're also starting to see really good examples where you see it in politics, you see it around issues around the environment or around gender equality or Black Lives Matters or LGBTQ, where people can be very divisive and curt, and where a woman will come in, and it's the Michelle Obama thing, when they go low, we go high, right? A woman will come in and not going to take it sitting down, right? But we are going to address it in a way that's more matter of fact. We're going to come at it from a position of, considering, I wouldn't say necessarily considering all sides, although frankly, that's what I do, but not everybody does, but really taking into account what's happening and how to address it in a rational and logical way. I don't want to paint a stereotype here, but it's the way a mom negotiates with a kid, right? So it is a innate ability that women have to understand nature, nurture, and negotiate.
If you negotiate, I don't often do that.
Not always. I started that whole thing by saying I'm going to paint this with a really broad brush. And by the way, that's a really excellent point, because I don't either, and I live, breathe, and sleep this stuff, right? Like, there are plenty of times where my amygdala kicks in and I am like, it just comes out. That's the fight, flight, or freeze system. And
it's a balance, right? Because there's a time for leadership where negotiation isn't part of the conversation, and someone needs to lead. And oftentimes women do that, to your point, with compassion and nurturing, even though it's not up for discussion. You can still deliver a message in a way that is that's compassionate, but it also shows strength and thought leadership around whatever the issue is. So I appreciate that. It's good.
I saw a meme recently online that looked at the COVID-19 situation with countries that were run by men versus the COVID-19 situation with countries that were run by women. And the countries that are run by women, and by the way, there are a decent number of countries run by women in this world,
Right.
They were faring better with COVID-19 than the ones run by men. I would love to do a study on that. Like, I want to see a study on what happened there, and because I don't know enough of the nuances to really dive into it in an interview. But
I think you should. Joanna, will you come back? We'd love to have you back on Close the Gap.
I would love to. That would be fabulous. I think it's great, and I love what the two of you are doing. Thank you so much for your work.
Can you share a little bit with our listeners about where they can find you on the internet, as well as your books, how they can get in touch with those?
Oh, yes. Thank you. I'd love to. So I have my website for my company, which is J.D. Massey Associates. The website is jdmainc.com. And I have a blog, and I talk a lot about issues having to do with the 5 generations in the workplace, and then also, communicating during a crisis, influencing people, that sort of thing. And then the books, which are Communicating During a Crisis, and then the second book is Culture Shock. They're both on Amazon. They're both on barnesandnoble.com. And Culture Shock is actually in Barnes and Noble stores and in other independent booksellers.
Fantastic. Wonderful. And they can reach you on your website.
Yes, they can. And actually, if they're interested, I do have a place where you can subscribe and you get pinged whenever I blog. And like I said, I believe in clarity and being simple and clear. So my blog posts are rarely more than a 2 or 3 minute read, just to give you little nuggets that you can catch really quickly during the day. I don't know about everyone else, but for me, my attention span has gotten so short, and it is really hard for me to be able to digest long stuff, but I still need the information. So when I can get it clearly, simply, and quickly. Yes, exactly.
The information and the inspiration. So.
Perfect. I love that. You're absolutely right.
Well, thank you again. We loved having you on our show today, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you. I loved being here.
Thank you for listening. You can find more information and connect with Christine or Tony at www.tffei.org or on LinkedIn at the Foundation for Female Equity and Inclusion.